I have been here so often it occurs to me as I walk 2 blocks from my home to 8th Street that I have reinterpreted all kinds of major artists. Sometimes I come and give a lecture here on reinterpreting Warhol, whom I'm reinterpreting all the time, sometimes Picasso, sometimes Matisse. And today I'm going to talk about new views, my own and other people's, of one of the landmarks of the history of Western art in general and modern art in particular, namely Jacques-Louis David, who, if I'm not mistaken, is always a respected artist. We know he is there, but very often not a beloved artist. People don't ooh and awe with pleasure over his work because mainly his art doesn't have to do in any overt way with pleasure. Anyway, he has been in the forefront lately with all of the events concerning the bicentenary of the French Revolution, in which he played an important role. And there was a major exhibition in Paris in 1989 to celebrate his existence, 200 years, as it were, of Jacques-Louis David, who is central to French culture. And both before, during, and after these events, I've had in my ordinary ways to deal with him as a major fact in the history of art, and I have begun to rearrange some of my own thoughts about him as well as absorb those of other people's. So what I want to do this evening in the scratchy voice that I bring you tonight, I'm sort of zonk because I just flew back from London and I'm feeling the pain. What I want to do this evening is talk about just a handful of very broad universal topics and the way they apply to David. And although I don't like big think words, I suddenly realized that this talk could be divided into 3 parts: religion, family values, as in George Bush and Charles Adams, and sex. So it will get more and more interesting, I hope, as things get along. First, religion. And I don't, that's fine, yeah. If in my position this evening of offering a kind of buffet of thises and that's about a major artist who lived from 1748 to 1825 and who has as many lives and as many styles as Pablo Picasso, in that position I just wanted to offer, for starters, a couple of relatively new and unfamiliar pictures by David that have been quietly turning up in the last decade and that have caused a certain domino series in terms of our way of reading him. One of the common preconceptions about Jacques-Louis David, of course, is that he is a forefront of revolutionary fervor in France in the 1790s, and he was, after all, a declared atheist, and he was also someone who voted for the death of the King and Queen of France, so that one is usually in the position of thinking about him as a thoroughly modern anti-Christian artist who in this way and in many others announces a world to come, the world in which we still live. Nevertheless, it has come as something of a slight surprise to realize that in the 1780s, the decade just before the Revolution, he was by no means, in terms of commissions, adverse to painting conventional religious subjects. There on the right, of course, is his famous, most famous martyr, Jean-Paul Marat, killed by Charlotte Corday in 1793, and soon after commemorated by David in one of the most famous propaganda pictures of all times, as well as one of the most moving. One would hardly think that somebody who was an avowed atheist, who could kill a king and who could destroy the monuments of Christianity, could be interested just 10 years or so before in painting Jesus Christ as another kind of martyr. But that, in fact, is exactly what Jacques-Louis David did. And the painting on the left, which appeared at the Salon of 1783, just a decade before Marat was martyred, is a real painting by David, and it is to be seen in Burgundy in a cathedral in Mâcon, a city best known for its wine. It is interesting, just to begin with, to look at these two pictures, which seem to be both BC and AD, but the more that one looks at David's traditional religious paintings, which are now 3 in number, the more one realizes clearly how the sense of some sort of supernatural martyrdom, the feeling of some sort of cosmic catastrophe and piety, was really translated very clearly from this world before 1789 to the events immediately afterwards. So that by now, I guess it is almost a commonplace in art history classes and textbooks to look at the Marat in terms of its being a sort of surrogate religious painting, one in which we feel that some extraordinary hero has been sacrificed for the good of mankind or humankind. And if we feel that, it is partly because Jacques-Louis David was so well steeped in the more conventional standard images of martyrdom, such as this figure of Christ against a catastrophic night sky. It's interesting to see that in painting these more conventional religious pictures, David, as was often the case in his art of the 1780s, looked backwards to respectable 17th century prototypes. For example, the painting on the right, now on display in the Louvre, by Philippe de Champaigne, a 17th century French painter, offers a very close prototype to David's effort to continue the tradition of great Baroque crucifixions. Another painting, which comes as something of a surprise in terms of David's career, loomed suddenly in, of all places, Quebec, Canada, in the cathedral there, after it was, as it were, discovered, a real painting by David and a religious one to boot. It finally got to the city's secular museum, but it had been hanging out in a shadowy altarpiece in Quebec for many decades before it was discovered. Anyway, there it is. And this, too, is a painting that looks backwards in a way as well as forwards. It is an image of Saint Jerome, and it is one that confirms David's penchant in the 1780s to reviving that aspect of Baroque style, generally classified as Caravagism, that is a kind of intense realism with particularly strong chiaroscuro, light-dark shadow effects, which give the figures a kind of palpable realism, a kind of 3D tangible presence with which David established some of the great reforms of style and structure in the 1780s. What I'm showing you on the right is a painting by Ribera, the Spanish Caravagist, in Naples, a picture which undoubtedly David himself knew and which seems to be, broadly speaking, the source of this 1780s venture into the depiction of a traditional Christian saint. This, in any case, provides just a few straws in the wind that may help to explain the particular intensity, a kind of mysticism that one feels in the most potent of David's avowedly atheistic, but nevertheless religious in character, martyr pictures of the early 1790s. The first one that he painted is in fact not known to us except in records of a drawing like this one after the lost painting and a torn print. But this is a dim ghost of a record of David's first effort to paint a revolutionary martyr, not Christ, not one of the conventional canon of Christian martyrs, but a man, Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, who was assassinated because he, in turn, had attempted to kill the king. Here he is depicted, as you can see, in a kind of pietà, a lamentation pose, and David, if we can judge from this drawing, used a kind of supernatural, iconic form, a sword, with a piece of paper that is pierced by it, in which his identity and his crime is made clear. Most interestingly, in terms of the present, the wonderful contemporary Italian neo-classicist, whom I'm sure many of you know, Carlo Maria Mariani, who loved Jacques-Louis David as I do, painted this picture as he imagined it actually might have looked, and there you can see the format, which of course you realize is a preview, just months before, in fact, of the next big martyr in the revolutionary canon for David, Jean-Paul Marat, whom you see here. The connection with religious experiences is one, in fact, that creeps up into very contemporary terms, because in the very year of the fall of the Bastille, 1789, two pictures were painted that seem to offer, as it were, the Christian preview of the theme of secular sanctity that you have on the right. One of them was this big painting on the left by David's arch rival, the same generation, and also someone who had a big art school in Paris. His name is Jean-Baptiste Regnault, and this is a conventional and highly dramatic or melodramatic deposition of a sort that revived, as David already had in the 1780s, the kind of big guns, the operatic style of Baroque religious martyr pictures. This was very well known. It appeared at the Salon, that is the public display of art in Paris, in the turbulent summer of 1789, which opened after the fall of the Bastille, and David must have sensed that this was a kind of rival image which he would have to replace, usurping, as it were, the throne of Christianity with the new deities of the Revolution. Even closer to home, his own student, Giraudet, one of the most precocious and original of his students, in the same year, 1789, essayed a very, very spooky and gloomy version of a deposition, which you see on the left. He was only 22 years old when he painted this, so that should make the art students here nervous. And it is a picture whose format, like the one we just saw, is vertical, as is the Marat, and one that also poses the strange kind of disposition in which half of the picture, the lower terrestrial half, seems to be earthbound and palpable, and the upper half, and this of course is accentuated by David's genius, turns into some sort of nowhere space, the equivalent of some kind of abstract background that you might see in a medieval painting. The intensity of the light which is something that David had learned from Caravaggio and his followers. You saw it in the St. Jerome, again begins to be transformed into something that is supernatural in character, and that already is a direction that was proposed by this brilliant, gifted student, Giraudet, in the deposition on the left. What I'm trying to get at is that looking at these relatively rare religious paintings of the 1780s, new ones that we've discovered by David himself, and older ones that were known about all the time by his contemporaries, students, and rivals, can help us to understand the peculiar genius and potency with which David managed to translate this Western Christian tradition into the service of a new kind of religion, that of the Revolution. One last image in this category, just to enforce this point. The next of the three martyr pictures by David, which in fact was never completed because of the swift changes of the Revolution, which very often meant that big plans for pictures had to be abandoned. Anyway, this is a curious martyrdom of a 13-year-old drummer boy whose name was Joseph Barras, and who was shot down when his revolutionary troop was captured, and he was supposed to shout "Vive le Roi," but instead valiantly, in a manner that paralleled what Barbara Friedrich did in our side of the Atlantic, shouted "Vive la République," and he was shot. That story may not be true, but it made terrific propaganda, and in this preparatory this sketch, it isn't actually a sketch, it's just an unfinished painting. He is displayed naked in a strangely androgynous manner. This is something that has more and more been commented on as the sexuality of David has emerged as a proper source of discussion these days. In any case, he is shown clutching the tricolor, which you probably can barely make out in this unfinished picture, in a manner which once more tends to translate the martyrs of the 17th century. This is a famous sculpture in Rome by Stefano Maderno of Saint Cecilia, dead and clutching the cross. Anyway, this kind of conventional Catholic imagery is, as you can see now, given a new metamorphic character in terms of creating heroes for the Revolution. That takes care of some of the religious matters I wish to talk about, and now I want to get into something which is much more speculative and involves certain fantasies or realities that I have been thinking about in terms of the curious kind of, so I would see it, give and take between David's very public art and, in fact, the private facts of his personal life, his wife and children, and how he felt about them and what he did with them. One of the most clear early demonstrations of a picture by David that seems to be both very public and very private is the great Hector and Andromache, a scene like so many from the period, inspired by a reading of Homer's Iliad. This painting of 1783 was his reception piece in the French Academy, the Royal Academy, the one that gave him stature there and put him up on the ladder of the hierarchy of the Academy to a superior position. It is a subject, the mourning of the great warrior Hector from the Iliad, by his wife Andromache and his son Astyanax, which was more and more common in the late 18th century, which so frequently turned to classical literature for sources of high-minded behavior. For instance, already about 1760, almost a quarter century before David painted this, the subject was essayed by a very curious Scottish artist named Gavin Hamilton, who spent most of his time in Italy, using the British tourists there as his clients. In any case, he tried the subject out. There it is in a painted form, and here it is in an engraved form, which is clearly the one that Jacques-Louis David had seen. There is no doubt about his knowledge of these prints from this precocious Scottish artist in Italy, and very often he took ideas from them and changed them to put his own stamp upon them. It is very clear in an obvious way, looking at these two works, that the first thing that David has done is to prune down the cast of characters so that there is no confusion about who is who, and what we have is a kind of intense distillation of the tragedy, which no longer seems to be a kind of public spectacle with servants, relatives, what have you, rushing in and out to attend the grief-stricken family. Rather, it has been stripped to three people, father, mother, and son, so that however venerable the theme is from the Iliad, however abstract the concept is of a hero who has died for his country, leaving behind him a widow and a child, all of this seems to be universal, except that the picture has about it an extraordinary intimacy, a kind of up-close intensity of feeling that infinitely transcends what had been done with the theme before. It's very relevant to note that in the 1760s and 70s, an artist of a generation just a bit earlier than David, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, had managed almost single-handedly to combine the sense of classical drama, classical formats, with a cast of characters who are completely contemporary and domesticated. John Russell, I'll never forget, put his finger on it exactly in a review of a Greuze exhibition. He said that his pictures combined Racine and Eugene O'Neill, and that is what we feel, for example, in this deathbed scene on the right, which seems to smack of French classical grandeur, but at the same time represents living people, real contemporary types of the 1770s in contemporary costume. And that tradition of giving a kind of dignity, a kind of grandeur to domestic scenes, to strife that has to do with the family tugs of war, with deathbeds and so on. This is something which lies directly behind the formation of Jacques-Louis David, so that we might almost say that David has learned a lesson from Greuze in terms of concentrating on family drama, except that instead of showing it in contemporary terms, he shows it still in terms of the grandeur and generalization appropriate to an illustration from the Iliad. What, however, has become more intriguing, to me at least, is what may have prompted the particular brilliance of this rendering of grandiose tragedy in terms of a family unit that is disrupted. Here is a curious fact. When David was 9 years old, his father was mysteriously killed in a duel. and the death of the father at the time was inevitably a huge childhood trauma for the young David, who was 9. This happened in 1757. In 1782, the year before this picture was painted, but it had been conceived then, he had got married, David, to a woman named Charlotte Pécule, and in fact, in the following year, when this picture was being painted, his wife gave birth to their first child, whom David painted just 5 years later in a relatively little-known portrait, a very tender but at the same time intense and characteristically austere image of his then 5-year-old son. This, of course, moves into the domain of psycho-speculation, which, of course, is pretty risky when you are dealing with people who have been dead for several centuries and who may not have had the same kind of psychological contours that we assume pertain to people today. Nevertheless, and I would like to explore this kind of thinking, the particular intensity of this family drama, the extreme importance of the desperate young child who is reaching up to his mother for some kind of succor, the feeling of a dead father displayed before the family. This is something that coincides so closely with the personal life of Jacques-Louis David that one feels that perhaps the special potency of this interpretation is in some part guided by the personal dramas of David's life. Another painting that may bear out generally this direction of interpretation is the ultra-famous Oath of the Horatii, which exploded onto the Parisian art world when it was shown there after being shown in Rome in 1784 in the year 1785. The story of the Horatii is a very complicated one, and I don't want to go into it in detail. It would be like telling the libretto of an opera by Wagner. But the story is a long and complicated one, and there are many episodes which can be selected for illustration. As early as 1781, that is 3 years before the picture was completed, Jacques-Louis David did a narrative scene from the long legend, which is a particularly brutal one that had been part of the French classical tradition and part of the famous drama by Corneille, the scene in which one of the Horatii triplets, they are triplets, the three who are taking the oath over there to go out and serve their country, one of them kills his very own sister because she had the gall to mourn one of the enemy, one of the Curatii, with whom she was in love. She is alive over there on the right-hand side. Anyway, that was one idea for the illustration of this long Roman legend. Another idea that he had for this was again outdoors, a public scene in which the father, that is the old man who was giving out the swords in the painting on the right, defends his son to the public, namely because of the fact that he killed his sister for a patriotic reason. She was unhappy, and because the enemy was her boyfriend, he is defending his own son, and the decision would be that he is in fact innocent of this murder. But the fact of the matter is that these two are sort of public scenes, one involving violence, the other law and order, and the working of Roman justice. And what Jacques-Louis David finally decided to do is to move the image back to some sort of imaginary early phase in the legend, which really is a scene, once again, of domesticity, but of a divided domesticity, as is unbelievably obvious, but brutally, clearly obvious, and something much talked about today, especially with the infiltration of feminist studies, is that the family has been rent asunder with the men on one side and the women on the other, a feeling that somehow the world has been divided into grandfather and the generation, then the sons over there on the left, the women in the family on the right, who are grieving because they, as it were, know that there is the potential of death and disaster. But this is all taking place within the very lucid confines of the home, the atrium of an imaginary Roman dwelling. Now, interestingly, in the back of the painting, there is a nurse figure who is succoring two children along with the women on the side. And I am eager to tell you that in 1784, the year that this painting was completed, David's second son was born. So we have two children there. This may, of course, just be coincidence, but there is nothing in the story that demands two children there. This is something that David put in, consciously or not. It's interesting to see, again, in terms of this kind of family-cism in which the men are pitted, as it were, against the women and children, that this is something that, again, is announced by Greuze in the previous decade, the 1770s. The reason for that deathbed scene by Greuze that I showed you some slides ago on the right is that the son has been disobedient, has walked out on the family, and he's going to take up a absolutely awful career as a mercenary soldier with the slouching figure over there on the right in the doorway. But this is something which, again, produces the kind of heroic family earthquake, father against son, women in a more conciliatory role, some hysterical, some pleading, desperate children, the kind of grand melodrama that has been frozen by Jacques-Louis David into something that sweeps away the mellow part of the melodrama and gives us this lapidary clarity, almost an emblem of the role of men versus the role of women, and this terrible patriotic moment when the family has to be rent in two. The third of these domestic tragedies by Jacques-Louis David, a series of extraordinary masterpieces, again has to do with family disorder. It became more and more common in the 1780s for artists to depict some of the most hair-raising kinds of Roman or Greek heroism, sacrifices of a very uncommon order. For instance, in 1785, in the same Paris Salon at which the Oath of the Horatii was exhibited, an obscure artist named Barthélemy painted the story of the Roman consul Manlius Torquatus, who is absolutely torn between family and state because he has discovered that his son is a traitor. There he is, Manlius Torquatus, on the top of the steps at the left, who with his right Roman arm is decreeing that his son has to be sentenced to death. That there was no other choice for a Roman lawmaker, but with his left hand, as you can see, he is touching his heart as if he was rent in two by this double obligation, family and state, even though inevitably state wins out. Not long after, Jacques-Louis David decided to tell another story in which a Roman consul was torn between these two major priorities, family and state, the story of Brutus, who, like Manlius Torquatus, discovered that not one but two sons of his were involved in a conspiracy of treason. The drawing on the right locates the scene in the more conventional arena, namely the public world, where there are a lot of people, spectators. That is, this is a kind of outdoor image of law and order. But very quickly, in the same year, 1787, David once more, as he had done in the case of the Hector and Andromache and the Horatii, removed the scene from the public area to a scene of domestic tragedy, and what he decided to do was something absolutely gruesome, a kind of grand guignol before there was a grand guignol. This is a scene in which the two bodies who have been executed, the two bodies of the sons, Titus and Tiberius, have been returned to the home by the lictors who are coming in on the left. Brutus sits on the left next to the statue of Mother Rome and is completely isolated from his family and the male attendants who, the family, the women now, who burst into a state of Bacchic hysteria. All of this, in a characteristically Davidian way, is frozen into the perfect clarity of the positioning of the figures and the perfect drama of light and dark, which contributes to this gruesome event imagined by David, with the corpses being brought into the family. The husband, Brutus, his back turned to the horror of his dead sons, but the women in the family, the mother and the two daughters, screaming in the blaring light as they see this spectacle. The muscular figure on the extreme right-hand corner is the nurse. And in fact, it has been suggested in the early documents in David, about David, that the nurse is the actual family nurse, the David family nurse Catherine, who posed, her face closed, for this figure. Once again, the family is the locale for this kind of heroic and grisly tragedy, and now even more than in the Horatii, the family has been split in two, with the heroic or iniquitous, depending on your viewpoint, Brutus, hard and heartless, over there in the shadows, and the woman and the wife and children completely isolated from him. I can hardly wait to tell you that in 1786, the year before he began to think about this theme, David's wife gave birth to twin daughters. who, there they are, he did a drawing of them, which is known in this engraving, of 1788, so they were about 2 years old when this was done. And it's very interesting that in the case of the woman and children here, he shows a mother with 2 daughters. There is nothing in the source that says this. He just invented this as a kind of parallel to his own family structure. So it seems to me he had 2 sons and 2 daughters, all born between 1783 and 1786, and this family, which has been practically guillotined in half, is so disposed. The next stage in my speculations about this family drama that has suddenly been translated into public artistic dimensions occurs now after the Revolution, and you may not be surprised to learn that Jacques-Louis David, well, we know he was a passionate revolutionary, and during the grim years, 1789 to 93, he practically had nothing to do with his family. He was much too busy being a Jacobin and attending one event after another, as well as painting pictures for the revolution and organizing vast pageants. It is no further surprise that when the French revolutionary laws suddenly made divorce possible, which would have been inconceivable before in a Catholic country. David was one of the first people, he was almost at the top of the list, to get a divorce, which happened on the 16th of March, 1794. And we can assume that it was probably a relief both to him as well as to his long-suffering wife, who must have suffered particularly in the first 4 years of the Revolution, in a way that almost seems to mirror what had been going on in his paintings. The divorce arrangement was that the daughters stay with the mother and the 2 sons stay with him. Inevitably, with the fall of Robespierre, David got into further trouble, and he was arrested quickly in the summer of 1794, just a couple of months after his divorce. And during this period in prison, he painted a self-portrait, which I show you here to give you some sense of the extraordinary, almost rabid intensity of this man as a personality and as an artist. While he was in jail, he began to think of another grand classical subject that would stop the succession of contemporary paintings that he was executing for the Revolution, those martyr pictures I showed you, and resume once again the grand themes that he had dropped in 1789. And what is most interesting in both the public and in private familial terms is his particular choice of subject. And that was an episode from another Roman legend, which has to do with the story of the rape of the Sabine women, and a kind of bloody internecine battle in which 2 tribes, one led by Romulus, the other by Tatius, are fused and breed a whole civilization, which establishes the legendary beginnings of the Roman Republic. The story of the rape of the Sabines was very common coin in the history of Western art, and particularly well known in the French tradition, thanks to the fact that Poussin, among others, had done two versions of it, of which the more famous for us is the earlier one here in the Metropolitan Museum. But this scene of rape and violence unleashed by Romulus, who was standing up there on the steps and, as it were, blowing the whistle to let everything begin to happen. This scene was a common one. What was relatively uncommon was the scene that David chose to paint in the legend, which shows us not the moment of violence and rape, but a scene of conciliation in which the heroic Sabine woman, Hercelia, this happens 3 years later, tries to appease the warring heroes, Romulus and Tatius, and to cause finally an end to this terrible civil war. This was occasionally depicted by artists in the 17th and 18th century. Here, in fact, is a painting by Guercino, which was part of the royal collections and is in the Louvre today. And in 1781, at the first salon in which David himself made his debut, a rival painter named Vincent painted this turbulent theme in which a heroine, she's over there on the right, Hercelia is her name, comes into the fray with the battling, raping men and tries to establish peace. This was a theme which seems to have smitten Jacques-Louis David, and he worked on it for nothing less than 5 years, between 1794 and 1799, finally producing for sole display, that is, the painting was shown all by itself as a kind of commercial enterprise, and something which gave it maximum focus because everybody was waiting to see what Jacques-Louis David would do after 5 years. Anyway, there it is, the painting in the Louvre. Interestingly enough, 2 years after, 2 years after Jacques-Louis David was divorced in the horrible year of 1794, then he remarried. That was in 1796. So that his own private life was involved again in a reconciliation, a kind of reuniting of the family that had been split under the Revolution. It's interesting to note that the character of the painting, in addition to reflecting, as it would seem to me, some of the turbulence and healing in David's own life, is one that also represents the drama of the revolutionary years themselves. For instance, it has been pointed out that the imaginary Roman fortress in the background of this painting seems almost to be a kind of classical prototype of the Bastille. There it is in a depiction of the very year in which it toppled, a painting by Hubert Robert, or the feeling of violence, of street violence, of murder, of corpses about, is something in David's classical painting that once more may echo the actuality of living through the revolutionary years, here in a slide that I'm afraid is all fuzzy in the middle. It's a split screen reproduction. Here is an image of one of the revolutionary scenes of the taking of the Tuileries in 1792. But it's worth thinking again of Greuze here, because he was an artist who, like Jacques-Louis David, was famous for the marital discord in his own home. He had a wife who was a famous shrew, and many of his scenes of domestic dramas may in fact reflect what was going on in his own house. Here is a drawing by Greuze of 1785, which shows a battle axe of a wife who is coming in and terrifying the husband and children, as well as the dog, you see, who barks at her. And then here, the part two is the lachrymose reconciliation, in which all is well. What I'm saying, among other things, is that the fact that Greuze, again, a very public artist, could offer in these domestic dramas some kind of glimpse of his own private family life must mean that it was quite possible for his contemporaries, i.e. Jacques-Louis David, to do the same, but perhaps in more couched ways. It's worth mentioning, P.S., that Greuze also got divorced in 1794 as soon as revolutionary law permitted it, except that, unlike David, he did not remarry. Looked at in this way, the cast of characters in the Sabines may offer also a kind of reflection of the David family structure, and we know here for sure that the nurse, whom you can see there, that is the old lady, is definitely modeled on the David family nurse, who, like his wife and children, was reunited to the David family in 1796. But the women here and the children seem in a way that expands what I've been getting at and talking about the other classical scenes may somehow reflect, if not in a one-to-one way, the women and children who had led such tumultuous lives because of their revolutionary father. It's worth mentioning, just to trace a final, well, not final, but one more act of the David family as it is reflected in his work. It's worth noting that the whole family, for the first time, appears as a unit in the most public of places, namely Notre Dame Cathedral, on the occasion in 1804, on a miserable rainy day, of the coronation of Josephine and Napoleon. But way up there in the bleachers, but in the row, that's Napoleon's mother, Madame Mère, sitting in great isolation in the middle, but in the tier above on the left, David and his family, at least his wife and daughters, are depicted. And unfortunately, this detail didn't work, but the women at the very top of the slide there are the Madame David and his two twin daughters, and he himself, you can't see him unfortunately, is behind. On a completely different wavelength, and now I am moving into sexier matters, on a completely different wavelength, one of the fascinating aspects of the Sabines on the right is the fact that David really meant it as a kind of whole new statement of his art, something that would push the revolution and its world into the background and wipe a slate clean for a new look, a new style, which he in fact referred to as Greek rather than Roman, even though the subject there couldn't be more Roman. but by comparison with the Horatii on the left, the style seems to have a more sensual, a more effete character. And one of the things that he meant when he was talking about being more Greek than Roman was to strip the clothing, the armor, the draperies off the men, because it was his idea that Greek warriors were stark naked when they went into battle, an idea that was nourished by many of the depictions of naked warriors on Greek vases and in Greek sculpture. This kind of archaizing, purifying, was in good part supported by art old and new. Some of the new classical illustrations by John Flaxman contributed to this flat, clean purity, and some of the works by Quattrocento painters, such as Raphael's master Perugino in an allegory on the left, which is a painting in the French royal collections and is in the Louvre still, may have contributed to this look of somehow unreal creatures who have absolutely perfect skin, the men even more prominently than the women in many cases, producing, as it were, a new kind of focus on ideal male nudity, which had been more or less clothed or concealed by armor and drapery in the earlier classical paintings by David of the 1780s. There, for example, is the figure of Romulus on the right, who is stark naked, and who has an unusually lithe and smooth and waxen body, as if marble were somehow beginning to melt. This aspect of David's work, the growing male sexuality, is something that in earlier decades either wasn't noticed or wasn't talked about comfortably, but in these more liberated days, just as the feminist issues of his painting have come into the fore, the strangely erotic exploration of the male nude by David as well as by his students seems to be something that enlists the attention and the interpretative faculties of many younger generation art historians. And for this is one of the pivotal trees from which many branches come. For instance, David's own students tended to push this direction much further. One of the more precocious of them exhibited this painting just after the completion of the Sabines, which actually depicts a gay classical myth, the story of Apollo, who was enamored of the young and beautiful Hyacinth, who was in turn killed by a discus. But here you can see this very, very overt demonstration of homoerotic love with these now even more melting, voluptuous male figures, which had already been essayed by David. Other students of David, this one is still unidentified, took other ideas from the Sabines and turned them into, again, very strangely fleshy fantasies, sometimes not man against man, but man against horse, a very curious kind of duo, which is very common in the early 19th century, when horses, of course, were more conspicuous in people's lives than they are today. But this is something that has a much strangely voluptuous kind of embrace, which is, as you can see, a free variation of the horse and rider on the right-hand side of the Sabines. And then just to pursue this direction further in David's art, one of the most extraordinary of his late Napoleonic paintings is this scene of the Spartan warrior, Leonidas, before his heroic defeat at Thermopylae, when he and his army were wiped out, a very curious scene of male nudity in which there is much embracing of old men and young men, men of the same age, but a curious kind of proliferation of an erotic male nude, which seems to move in a direction quite different from the more discreet depiction of ideal classical heroes in the 1780s. Other aspects of these sexual currents in David began to appear somewhat more unexpectedly in his late work when he was an old man exiled in Brussels after the fall of Napoleon. He had voted for the death of the king, and as such he could no longer remain in France. So in 1815, when he was now 63 years old, he had to leave Paris for Brussels, where he was to die 10 years later. By the middle of the 19th century, David's classical ideal style looked more and more beside the modern point, and that is a fact that is made very succinctly clear by Daumier in this lithograph of 1855, which translates the two combative protagonists on the right, Tatius and Romulus, into a kind of a dirty artist realist in the manner of Courbet, and a very, very lean and effete idealist who holds his palette like a shield and his brush like the attenuated javelin on the right. This, of course, seems to be a complete contradiction of David's world. But one of the most fascinating aspects of new approaches to David concerns a new reading of his late paintings, which used, and I remember this vividly from my own education, used to be scorned. The situation was not so unlike our attitudes toward late Picasso. There were many decades when nobody liked late Picasso, and then suddenly everybody, with some stubborn exceptions, began to see the light. But that is the sort of thing that's been happening with late David, and one of the reasons is that we have new ways of seeing these pictures. This painting on the left is in fact the last picture he executed in 1824 when he was 76 years old, the year before his death, and it is an overtly sexy scene which represents the god of war, Mars, who is being seduced into erotic pleasure, a supine position, by Venus with the assistance of the three Graces on the right, and a little Cupid below who is deftly and puckishly untying Mars' sandals so he can get on with the sex in bed. The conventional approach was that this was a very, very sorry falling off for a great master like David, who represented, as you see by the Horatii, virility, a feeling of aggressive combat, a feeling of patriotic ideals, as if David had become sort of a laid-back hippie who was saying, make love, not war, and who had lost all of the energy, all of the raison d'etre of his commitment to patriotism, to utopian revolutionary ideals, etc. This painting on the left was considered, as it were, a kind of embarrassment, his career ending with this erotic whimper rather than with the grand statements of his prime. Nevertheless, other ways of seeing these pictures may change our reading of them. And one of the most fruitful ways, it seems to me, is to realize that these pictures are meant in good part as parodies. That is, he, like Daumier later, was undoing the very classical tradition which he had constructed, and very often even making fun of his students who, unlike him, were now busy working under the aegis of France. He was in exile in Belgium, very often offering, as it were, kind of rip-offs or jokes of their work. Ingres was undoubtedly his most genius-ridden student, and also one of the most strange and inventive in his early career. And this famous early painting by Ingres of Jupiter and Thetis is one which I suspect David may have had in mind when he painted the absolutely fake stage smoke that seems to suggest on the bottom of this painting Olympus, way up there in the Greek heavens, but the whole thing has about it a completely phony quality, as if this were a charade and the whole thing was put together in a stage-like way. That is something which we see in the Ingres, with those great clouds of smoke supporting an unbearably heavy throne. But Ingres was not making a joke about it the way I think that David was. Another aspect of this exaggeration, almost a kind of satiric version of what his students were doing, and a feeling that the whole classical myth of style that he had invented was collapsing, and he was going to contribute to its collapse. Another aspect of it is the extraordinary figure of Venus there. There is the famous Ingres Odalisque, which predates this, I hasten to say, by 10 years, 1814 to David's 1824, and the incredible wriggling body that she has with these curves that just seem to extend like taffy or eel, just something that you can keep pulling and stretching. This is something that David has pushed, if you will, even several vertebrae further than in the case of the Ingres. If you look at the three graces there, they have kind of dopey expressions, as if they were hat check girls who were getting rid of Mars's helmet and shield, so that we could move into the brothel part of the scene. So that the whole thing, so it seems to me, has a spirit of spoof to it, which is not an indication that he had lost his touch, but that he was on to something new. That is a point that I think is even clearer in an earlier work from his last years, the Cupid and Psyche over there on the right of 1817, which again picked up on a theme that was very common in his own earlier milieu. One of his own students, Gérard, painted this famous version of the Loves of Cupid and Psyche in 1798. It's a big prominent picture in the Louvre, and it would seem to me, again, that David was trying, as it were, to poke fun at the extreme idealism that had been cultivated by his own progeny. Here is a 3D version of the same theme. This is a work by Canova in the French collections, which again has this lofty eroticism. In the case of David, however, we suddenly move to something that has a curious tinge of low-down, even vulgar reality. One of the remarkable things about this painting, which, if I didn't say so, is in the Cleveland Museum, is the utter discrepancy in style between the figure of Psyche the sleeping Psyche, and the figure of Cupid, who has to figure out after a night of love how to disentangle himself from her embrace. Ang, in fact, had painted a very famous pendant, a sleeper, to the famous odalisque, but the picture is lost. But we have this drawing after it on the left. It's a work that undoubtedly David knew, either from the original or from variations upon it, but it is an ideal sleeping nude, as you can see, who has a canonic posture of a sleeping Venus, which in fact is repeated in this painting that David executed in a completely different milieu in Brussels in 1817. She is completely unreal, whereas Cupid, sorry about the crack in that, is so real that we feel we could recognize him were he to rise from the dead. And in fact, we know that David used a specific name, teenage model, which was hardly the case with the Psyche, who seems to be a completely abstract creature. This kind of joke on classical imagery is one, of course, that has a famous pedigree in the work of one of David's heroes and inspirations of the 17th century, namely Caravaggio. And I show you here a famous Caravaggio of Love Victorious, in which we have a very impish young man, probably one of Caravaggio's many boyfriends from the streets of Rome, who seems to be wearing wings that are glued onto his back like stage props, and who has allegorically triumphed over much more serious things that are represented allegorically by the still life around him. That same kind of impishness, the vulgarity that pollutes and at the same time rejuvenates classical antiquity, is very apparent in the figure of Cupid over there on the right. And one of the most extraordinary things is the way he is trying to get the ball of his left foot out of the nest of draperies in which he has spent the night. And what's going to be even harder for him is getting her arm over his leg so that he can sneak off once again. So that the feeling is of a very, very naughty and awkward teenager who has spent a night with this ideal classical marble, and he's figuring out very cutely how he is going to disentangle himself and get back to the streets. This is, in fact, I think, quite consciously a joke picture, and it is one, therefore, that says, at least to me, that David has not become an incompetent master who cannot follow his own teaching, but somebody who has realized that the 19th century, especially if you had moved from Paris to provincial Brussels, was a very different world, and that these ideals could no longer be thought of as true. This is something, in fact, which really launches a new tradition rather than closing an old one in a feeble way. I show you here a painting, an early work by Courbet, that has something of the same character, an ideal posture that is culled from a classical repertory, but a girl who, in her corpulence and her undress and her protruding feet, could hardly be less classical in her demeanor, not to mention the double chin, a point that is further confirmed by Courbet's other parodies later of classical postures, such as this one of 1862, where you have a sleeping Venus type, except that she is still wearing stockings, one of which comes up to, the other one of which does not come up to her knee. This, in fact, is really the spirit behind these late works of David, I think, and the point can be lastly corroborated by what we know of the attitude of the great Manet toward the art of the past. This is a copy that Manet made as a young man of Titian's Venus of Urbino, but as you all know, within something like 5 years, she was transformed into a modern prostitute, Olympia, who in fact affects that same kind of joke upon the traditions of the past that David began to explore in these late and I hope newly appreciated and explored works by David in Brussels. As a final slide, let me show you a painting that I think gave me my initial insight into this reading of the late David, namely Mel Ramos, his California version of the Cleveland Cupid and Psyche, in which he takes the role of Cupid. That is a self-portrait of Mr. Ramos, and his girlfriend is a perfect California surf girl, and we are looking at a local national park through the window. In any case, that is just one of the many branches from David's tree, and I hope I have set your minds into motion this evening and made you like him as much as I do. So thank you very much.